Hi, welcome back to Peregrine. Again, speaking to you from the beautiful Calonque in Marseille. And I do actually live in Paris, but I spend a lot of time in Marseille, so to be honest, it's more beautiful landscapes by the sea. So, anyways, today I'll be talking to you about French work culture. So, I gathered 8 myths or claims about French work culture that I hear quite a lot, and I'll be taking them by one, telling you whether I think they're true, not true, giving you some stats, laws, but especially anecdotes from my own life, so I can share a little bit with you what you can expect if you're ever going to work here. This video is for you basically if you're thinking of living in France one day, specifically Paris. If you're already here, maybe you're a bit confused, you don't know what's going on, or you're just curious and you want to compare to where you are. Of course, I'll be making some generalizations about French work culture. So just disclaimer here, I'm not trying to say every company is like this. Every company has its own ways of working. But I think when you look at a country overall, you do see some trends in how people interact, how they act, and that's really interesting to know when you're going to go somewhere. And if you're wondering where I'm coming from with these stories, just so you know, I am actually French, born and raised, but I did spend about half of my life abroad in the US, Finland, South Korea. So on the one hand, working in France is kind of organic to me. I just know the unwritten rules, but I've spent enough time abroad that I'm able to also take a bit of a step back and question things or realize that they're happening. So I just want to share that perspective with you. And of course, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments if you have different experiences you want to share. The first claim is in France we have a 35-hour work week. And this one is sort of true. So actually we do have a law stipulating that the work week is 35 hours long. But what that actually means is that any time over 35 hours is considered overtime. It doesn't actually mean that you won't work any more than that. So what you should do if you're not sure, you should check your contract. Your contract will stipulate that you're working 35 hours plus a certain number of hours of overtime per week. It's considered overtime, and then your pay or your amount of time off will reflect that. It will reflect this extra amount of time that you're expected to work. And out of curiosity, I actually looked at some stats at how many hours people work, and in Europe generally the hours are around 40 hours. It doesn't really move around that much, and compared to the US, the average is apparently 41.5. And frankly, as someone who has worked and lived in New York, that really surprised me. I thought it would be a lot more, but of course it's an average, so it could be more or less. Another number that was interesting in the stats was what percentage of people work more than 50 hours per week. And in France, it was around 7.7. So that's actually a lot more than other countries in Europe, like the Netherlands or Norway, where it's kind of half of that, and in the US it's 11%. If you're thinking that France is a place to go for some really easygoing short work weeks, this is not the place. And something to keep in mind about the 40-hour work week is that it doesn't include the 5 hours you'll have for lunch during that week. So you're looking already at 45 hours. If you want to calculate how long you will spend physically in the office, that's what it looks like. So to give you an example, for me, I get to the office around 9:30 to 10, which might be a little bit late in other countries, but here it's quite normal. And then I start to go home around 7 or 7:30. Of course, I'm not working in person right now, but when we were, that's what it looked like. So yeah, if you want to calculate how long you're spending in the office, it's going to be more like 45, easily 50. Things really can stretch out quite quickly. So since we're talking about lunch, let's get to the next claim, which is that in France, we have a guaranteed 1 hour lunch break. And to be honest, I even found claims that we have a 3-hour lunch break, that we have a 2-hour lunch break guaranteed in the summer. And that's a scam. Otherwise, I've been scammed for years because I've never had a 2-hour lunch break guaranteed. But it is true that we actually have a law that not only says our lunch break should be 1 hour, but that we're not allowed to eat at our desks. So you can see how serious it is that in France, and it really comes to the history that we have with unions and really making sure that employees' rights are really respected. So the rule is really very clear. We need 1 hour to just completely leave our work behind, completely focus on our lunch, where we can, just decompress, disconnect, and eat with your colleagues. So either you would go out to a restaurant nearby, or you have actually a cafeteria in your company. And what's really nice as well is that lunches tend to be subsidized, so that's one less thing to worry about. And you do have that 1 hour. But there's actually a fun fact that about a month ago, the rule was changed a little bit, that it is actually possible now for companies to let you eat at your desk if the company is unable to ensure that you have a safe distance to eat. And that's just COVID related. So that tells you how deep of a law that is, or how deep of a way of thinking it is. When you eat lunch, you're eating lunch. When you're working, and you don't really mix the two. And also one quick note I have about lunch is I keep hearing that in France we can drink wine, we can drink beer at lunch, it's totally normalized. And frankly, I've only seen that once when I was eating lunch with a client, and the client was like, yes, let's get a glass of wine to celebrate. That was actually quite unusual. I mean, I can't speak for every company, but I know everywhere I've worked, if somebody started to drink a beer or wine at lunch, we'd be asking them if they're taking the afternoon off. So don't expect this to be totally professional and normal behavior. This, I think, is more of a myth than truth. So the next claim is that in France we have 5 weeks of paid time off. And that is actually true, thankfully. And as I mentioned in my pillars video, this is actually one of the reasons why I came back, because in the US, 2 weeks can feel like a luxury depending on your job. So 5 weeks is amazing. So the way it works is if you are a full-time permanent employee, you are guaranteed 5 weeks. The way they count it is that for every month of work, you get 2.15, I think, days off. So that's 5 weeks overall. Depending on your workplace, it may be more or less flexible when you take that time. So I think the only thing by law is that you'd have to take at least 2 weeks in a row in the summer. So anytime between May and September, and the rest is kind of up to you. But some companies may close in August, for instance, for the whole month. And then like 4 weeks of yours are just kind of like imposed that you have to take them at that time. Maybe your company closes between Christmas and New Year's. And then again, it's like imposed and you don't get to choose. But I think it's still a good deal. You still get the 5 weeks, you still get to rest, and you may just have to make some adjustments in your personal life about, your travels and so on if your company doesn't let you choose all those days. And actually, there are situations where you get more than 5 weeks, and that's when, looking back to my next point, if you work overtime, either it's kind of like accidental and you just had a project, you're working a lot of hours, so then those extra hours add up to extra time off, or it's like implied already or anticipated in your contract that because of your role, because of how busy you'll be, you will get extra days off to compensate for that. So you could end up with even like 7 weeks off per year. But yeah, 5 to 7, that sounds good to me. So the next claim is that French companies are highly hierarchical. And I have to say, I think that this is true. So to explain a little bit what hierarchy means, a very hierarchical company would be, for instance, in South Korea, where you have these different ways of referring to people based on their seniority level, where you really have to stay in your place. You cannot speak up if you're not senior enough. And a very non-hierarchical environment would be, for instance, in Finland, where even an intern could walk up to their boss and say what they want. I mean, respectfully, but share ideas, and it doesn't really matter so much what your position is. France is somewhere in between the two, but a bit more on the conservative side. So what that means basically is that you may not really be welcome to voice your opinions or to speak up in certain environments if you're not senior enough. So I do have some examples of that. Even for me personally, I've had situations where I'm interacting with a client and they will ask me to speak with somebody who's at their level in my company. So let's say they're a manager, they want to speak to another manager, and that makes them feel like then they're on an equal playing field. It may feel a bit like an ego trip, and sometimes it is, but it's just a way that people are used to working, so it just makes them feel a bit more comfortable. And when someone is more senior, they feel more at ease at what's being said. I also have an acquaintance who was in a meeting. She's a bit similar to me, where she was born in France, lived in the US, and came back. And in a meeting, she spoke up while somebody else was making a presentation. She made a suggestion about something that could be done based on something similar she'd done in the past. And she was told afterwards by her manager that that wasn't her place, that she shouldn't have spoken up, she shouldn't have, made suggestions because she's not senior enough to comment on somebody else's work. And in some countries, that would not happen. In some companies in France also, maybe that may not happen, but it's not so unusual in France that there are still these kind of strict roles and these strict ideas about, kind of stay in your place. I'm lucky enough to work in a field that is quite progressive in design, so I can usually speak a bit more openly, and those roles are not so, not so strict. But because I do work with clients that are a bit more old school, I do bump up against that a little bit. So if you're somebody who just really hates hierarchy, hates these kind of stiff structures, then the French company is probably not the right place for you, depending on the industry. So the next claim is that in France, we like to discuss things rather than make decisions specifically in meetings. And this one is a bit funny because my first thought was, no, that's not true. We make decisions all the time in France. But then I realized, thinking back a little bit, that actually I have observed that, without realizing it. So to tell you a bit about, some examples from my life. I was working some time ago on a project that was really, really complex. We had so much information, many different ways that we could go. And so we just really needed to make decisions about a lot of things. Do we go this way? Do we go that way? Do we interpret things like this or like that? And that does require us to discuss. And at some points in those meetings, I would feel that they're unproductive. And I was also the project manager at that point. So I would say like, okay, it seems like we're just talking in circles. Let's just table this and come back to it later. Or like, hey, I still don't really see it, but let's move forward with that. And hopefully I, catch on later. But what I could see in those moments was that my coworkers were really, really uncomfortable with that kind of, it felt really unresolved to them. And I think that's why I was influenced by my time, especially in Finland, of just being straightforward, to the point, not wasting time. But here, that's not really how things are done. And again, it depends. Like, for instance, I've worked sometimes with developers who have like these agile ways of working where meetings are like really structured and you need to make decisions at the end of every meeting. But if you're not in that kind of like really like structured environment, you may find yourself like discussing things over and over and maybe even finishing a meeting where the decisions aren't made. So yeah, what I would suggest for that, if you really want to, kind of cut through that, definitely make decisions before, set the rules before you get into those complicated conversations. I think, like anywhere else, that's when people are a bit more open, is when things are not heated. Just say ahead of time, like, hey, why don't we try this approach that after 2 minutes we have to make a decision, or after 2 minutes we have to table the conversation. Just something that, you can discuss what the rules are before you get into it. And actually, I think that if you're a foreigner, you will have a little bit more leeway to break those rules because people won't expect you to kind of know or follow. And actually, as a subcategory of this claim, I want to say that I heard that we fight at work in France, that people have these screaming matches. Personally, I've never seen that happen, and I would consider that really unprofessional. So if you hear that a lot in your workplace, it might be a little bit toxic. I wouldn't say it's normal. Of course, like anywhere else, the tones rise when you get to a conversation where people don't agree. But, actually screaming fights, that is not normal. The next point is that in France, presenteeism is highly valued. So first, let me explain what presenteeism. Presenteeism is the idea that you have to be there in person to show that you're doing work. And in France, that is something that is still actually quite valued. And of course, that's like outside of COVID, because I have been working from home for the past year now. Before that point, it was really expected that if you're not physically in the office, it's hard for people to know that you're doing your work. That's why it may be hard, even if you finish your day early, to just get up and go home. People might be a little bit confused. It's like, oh, are you taking the afternoon off? So it's really appreciated that you're there in person. Otherwise, you're not necessarily trusted to do your work. And I have a few examples of this. For instance, I had a coworker at some point who was taking a train to get back like early in the morning and then go to work. But actually her train was late. And when she came back, 2 hours late, one of her bosses told her, hey, well, it sounds like you need to fill out some paperwork to ask for the half day off. And even though she could have easily, added those hours on somewhere else, or maybe one could say she's been working a bit extra before, or she'll make sure her work gets done. Just the fact that she wasn't sitting in her chair for those 2 hours was enough for her to have to ask for the half day off. And that's actually quite common. And even when I speak of COVID, we actually had a period in the summer when it looked like things were kind of getting better, and some companies started to say, okay, playtime's over, everyone has to be back at the office 5 days a week, as if it were not serious work when people are working from home. So not every company is like that, but it is quite common. And again, even in this progressive design field where I work, the rule before COVID in my company was that working from home, so remote working, was only allowed Tuesday to Thursday. And the reason is because they don't want you to take a Friday or a Monday and take a long weekend. Because the idea is if you're taking Monday off, they don't know where you are. You could be in Spain, you could be enjoying a long weekend. And so the idea that you're there, that they can watch you, creates that trust. And that's a bit unfortunate compared to some other cultures where working remotely is really highly encouraged. What I think is important to keep in mind is that in France, it's not just managers kind of oppressing you and telling you have to be there. It's also, to a large extent, from what I have seen, employees who decide they have to be present. So again, for the past 12 months, I've been to the office a handful of times, but I know coworkers of mine who go to the office anywhere from 1 to 5 days a week. And that's while the government is recommending that we spend 0 days a week in the office. And that's because that's what they feel more comfortable with. They feel like they have to be in that chair in the office to like be more productive or feel more connected to their work. And while that has its values as well, of course, it shows how deep that culture is, that you have to be present, you have to be in the physical office to be working. So if that's something that you have an issue with, France may not be the place for you again, or at least really research that you're in a company or going to a company that is more flexible on that. And let's see, maybe within the next few months, next few years, once this whole thing ends, hopefully at some point, we'll see how things shake out and how many of these rules change for the long term. So the next claim is that in France, cheek kisses are mandatory in the workplace for saying hello every day. So this, I would say, is not true. So of course it may depend on your workplace, but in my experience, it's something that you only do very rarely. It has like this more formal feeling to it somehow. So I've only cheek kissed my coworkers on my very first day, and it was a way for them to say hello and welcome. I even have a coworker who was like, "Oh, I hate cheek kisses, but because it's your first day." Or sometimes when meeting clients for the first time, I might do a cheek kiss as well, and it's like women to women, women to men, sometimes men to men. But it's of course also totally acceptable to just hold out the hand. And something I think is interesting or important to keep in mind is that even we don't really know. There's no hard and fast rule of when you have to kiss somebody on the cheek. We sometimes are like, "Oh, on se fait la bise," or, we also don't know. So it's okay if you have this awkward moment, someone holds out the cheek, someone else the hand, and you'll figure it out. Of course, now in COVID, you just wave from a distance. I don't even see any elbow touches anymore, so you don't have to worry about it too much right now. But I would say, yeah, with friends, cheek kisses every time. In the workplace, first meeting, and even that is not mandatory. You might need to see how your own company is about it though. But actually, funny story, the other day I was on the metro in Paris and I saw two people who looked like colleagues, end of day, saying goodbye with masks and everything, and they did a cheek kiss. So, you know what, I don't know. There could be some people for whom it's so deeply entrenched that they have to greet with a cheek kiss, even with the masks on, even when it's unsafe. But yeah, definitely don't feel that pressure, and if someone teases you about it, it doesn't matter. Just hold out the hand. And for now, just wave at a distance and we'll see what happens and how it shakes out in a year or two. The next claim is that it's impossible to find a job in France if you don't speak French. So this one is not true, but I would recommend kind of having this general attitude. So what I mean by that is that there are companies and jobs that you can find where you will only speak English. For instance, if you're a software developer and you're using anyways languages in English, you can definitely find a job in English. It's even a field, let's say, where there's a lot of search for talents, including talents from abroad, and you're not necessarily client-facing, so it's okay if you can communicate in French. I also know a person who's a therapist, who's American, and she's doing her practice here in English. I really don't know how it shakes out in terms of licenses, because I think it can be a little bit delicate if you're anywhere near healthcare. But yeah, in her case it works. So if you're a freelancer of some kind and you want to set up your activity, I also know a Finnish journalist who is writing for Finnish newspapers while living in France. So you can find or create these opportunities for yourself. And you can also work in companies that are really international, and you might even be interacting with clients, but those clients are, on an international level, and so you would be speaking English every day. But that is less the norm. And the reason why I say have the attitude that you will have to speak French is because most companies will require that. And even if they don't, it's going to make things so much easier for you to communicate, for you to connect with people, for you to understand what's going on. It's also going to signal to people that you care and that you care about the culture, that you're really interested, more so than just staying in a bubble and speaking English. And I actually give this advice to people going anywhere. And I say this as someone who's lived in Finland for 2 years, a place where you can easily live without learning any Finnish, especially in Helsinki. When I lived in Finland, I learned Finnish. I learned. I'm not saying I know all the Finnish there is to know, but I actively studied Finnish because it was important for me to get around, for me to show people that I cared about being there, that I cared about the culture, that I want to communicate. And it really made a huge difference for me. And in France, that's really appreciated. And let's face it, French is not a language that's spoken by a small handful of people because of, the huge cultural impact of France and the French language. And unfortunately, because of colonialism, French is spoken in so many places. So it is a bit surprising to people here if you come and you don't speak French. They're a bit confused. They don't know why you came. So, if you're going to come, it's okay if you don't speak fluently when you arrive. But have some intentions. take some classes, ask your company. So if your company, they have some classes that they can sponsor, or that they have in-house. In some bigger companies that is actually possible. Or there are actually some really cheap classes you can take with the city hall of wherever you live. I heard that the ones in Paris are really, really high quality. So there are always options. So even if you don't speak fluently, just signaling that you're open and you have the intention is going to make you like a lot more welcomed. And that's what I've experienced anywhere, not just in France, where you have this reputation of like having bad English. And look at me. I may be French, but I do speak English really well. And of course, I kind of cheated. I've lived abroad for a long time, but just goes to show it is possible. But even if French people speak English really well, which to be honest happens more and more, it's still really nice to see that when people come here, they speak French as well. Alright, so that was me reacting to like 8 facts or claims about French word culture. Let me know in the comments whether you recognize any of these things, or tell me about your own stories. I'd be happy to start a conversation. And please like this video and subscribe to hear more from me. I'll be here at Peregrine telling you about my experiences living, working in France, Finland, and elsewhere. Thanks for stopping by. See you next time.